Hey, everybody. Um, Welcome to Lecture 6 for Communicating Through Form. We're going to be talking about typography. This is our second typography lecture. One of the core things that I really want to get through on this lecture, get through to you as students, is that typography is, in essence, a recursively growing system. Now, what do I mean by that? Is that typography is a set of rules and conventions that can be applied to something very small like the shape of letters and very quickly um, grow out and cycle out until it applies to things as large as books, billboards, everything that you see. So let's take an example of our letter. This is a letter L. It's pretty simple. It's a very clear shape of form and counterform, black and white. And that's all that letters are in essence, are just recognizable shapes. What you'll notice about this L is it has these little bits on the edges, which are known as serifs. Largely, typefaces can be broken down between serifed and sans serifed categories. And we'll talk a little bit more detail about that shortly. The moment we start to put this letter in context of other letters, we see that there are a lot of shared aspects, that we're actually applying certain key aspects from across an entire system in the shape of a font or a typeface. So if we start with that L and we look at the serifs, you'll notice that those serifs repeat at the bottom of most of these letters. Similarly, if you look at the shape of the N, you can see that same shape emerging in the P and key aspects of that shape emerging in the R. In essence, it's the repetition of these forms and the application of these rules that starts to make typefaces and fonts recognizable as being all part of the same consistent system. A letter is kind of a special thing. If we start with just a letter, we can start to combine multiple letters together, and very quickly we come to words. Now, words can quickly assemble into longer strings and assemble to form a line. As words assemble into a line, lines will then multiply and collect into a paragraph. And this is where meaning can really start to foment. Paragraphs will form into whole text eventually. But there are a whole bunch of different conditions to how to set text. There are a whole bunch of terminology and terms that we want to talk about. One of the key aspects is leading, and that is the vertical space between lines of text. How much leading you need is very contingent on the size of the typeface, the type of typeface you choose. It's a really subjective thing, so there's no actual formula for getting the right leading. The term leading comes from early days of printing or actually a majority of printing history, where you would actually physically put thin strips of lead between lines of text to increase the space between lines. If you have too little leading, the words can crash into each other and become barely recognizable and very difficult on the eyes. Meanwhile, if you put in too much leading, what you end up having are letters or what you have are lines that start to fall apart and seem more like a list than a paragraph. Establishing good leading is like establishing good rhythm in the song. Another convention to look out for is line length. If you have tight leading and your line length is too long, it can be hard for someone's eyes to read through a text and reset at each turn. What can happen is very quickly your eye can fall off a line into a different line. If you've read, anyone who's read a novel knows this feeling well. You can have extremely short line lengths, and it can create a much more faster paced staccato feeling in your reading experience. The edges of paragraphs also come with their own conditions. Oftentimes, when you type out text, they will set in what's known as flush left, rag right format, which means that on the left side, the line is perfectly flush, whereas on the right-hand side, the ends of sentences break off in a relatively even pace of in, out, in, out. This creates a pleasing experience, and it also ensures that for languages that read from left to the right, your eye always knows where to reset on the next line. You can also flush things to the right and rag them left. This becomes a little bit more difficult to read in the English language, so this is usually reserved for smaller pieces of text. Similarly, you can center type, you can break type up across your page, you move it around a frame. There are sort of endless possibilities. Another possibility is justification. Most novels, most long form pieces of text that we read are hard justified. Here are some basic anatomic details of a typeface. We're going to use this word, hand gloves. Typographers love using the word hand gloves because it has a mixture of a whole bunch of different typographic details. Firstly, let's talk about our baseline. The baseline is the line at the base of a typeface that establishes a consistent horizontal direction. Oftentimes you'll see that certain letters, especially rounded ones, will dip slightly below the baseline, and this is intended to create a sense of balance and groundedness. And the other horizontal line I want to talk about is the X height. This is the other dominant, this is the slightly less dominant, but another dominant horizontal line that you see when you look at type. And this is determined by the height of the lowercase x of a given typeface. Some typefaces can have very small x heights, like a typeface like Garamond, whereas a typeface like Verdana has a very tall x height. In addition, there is also the cap height, as well as the ascender height. Inside the negative spaces of letters is known as what is known as counters. And the dominant vertical strokes of every letter is known as the stem. Ascenders ascend slightly above the cap height usually, and descenders descend below the baseline. Certain letters have crossbars, and certain fonts have serifs, like I said, and some are sans serifed. On that note, let's go through a rough form of typographic classification. There's no single right way to classify typography because it's a really subjective field. But for the purposes of understanding the conventions, we're going to talk about a few sort of types of typeface that we're talking about. When printing first began, letter forms were drawn and carved out of lead to replicate the look of a human hand holding a pen. So a pen usually has an angle, a stroke angle, and what you'll notice is that these serifs are very organic, and they have an almost curved quality to them. Here we can see the angle of this typeface, and here is an example of a text that uses a old style typeface. This is using standard Garamond, and what you'll see is it creates an air of a sort of very a very clear text, like a very textual air, I should say. This is a piece of philosophy from the 19th century. Let's talk about transitional typefaces. So by the 18th century, printing technology started to change very drastically. Paper got denser. The sort of mixtures of metals where people experimented with the mixtures of metals more. And so what the result is that as the technology changed, the form started to match that technology. This is Baskerville. What you'll notice about Baskerville is that we're transitioning away from that human-handedness of the typeface. You'll see that the serifs are much straighter, are much more almost machine-like, that the angle of the sort of imaginary pen of this is now vertical. This is an early book Bible printing by the type designer and printer Baskerville. Here's a contemporary book cover using Baskerville at this moment. And let's continue further and further onward. When I say modern, many people often think that we're talking about sort of contemporary typefaces of sans serif typefaces. But what we're really, when we talk about modern in a typographic context, we're talking about this further extension along this trajectory towards more machine-like, sleeker, slimmer typefaces. This is Bodoni. And what you'll notice is that now the serifs no longer have those bracketing curves, that there's a very distinct parallel, right angle parallel to this typeface. It's almost as if it's engraved out of steel and then machine pressed. I guess all typefaces are. We can see this at a much closer angle, that a lot of the human hand qualities of the pen are getting lost now to this in this typeface. Modern typefaces have now become sort of associated with fashion. We've seen them in band names. You see them everywhere. Now, in the 19th century, we saw the rise of new kinds of printing technologies that, with the birth of the large-scale advertisement poster, new kinds of typefaces were created that were much more ornamental or carved out of wood. And so this also gave birth to the slab serif, which uses which is a serifed typeface, but has a large blocky serif, oftentimes matching the stroke of the typeface itself. This is called Clarendon. And here is a poster from the US Civil War that starts to, that shows how these large-scale advertisements determined the sort of production of these new typefaces. In essence, that when large type started to get printed on posters, you couldn't make them out of metal anymore because they would have been so unwieldy. And if they were to drop, they would, slice someone's foot off. So instead, what people started to do was carve letter forms out of wood. And those wood letter forms suddenly the potential of them opened up the possibility of new kinds of ornament. Here's some contemporary printing with the slab serif. After some time, I guess into the 19th century, I should say, also came the birth of the humanist typeface. And these are sans serif typefaces whose curves, once again, are meant to match the stroke of a human hand. This is Gil Sans. This is one that you see often on Penguin books. This book will come back to haunt us a few times today. From there, we also have grotesques, which are more industrial sans serif typefaces, so slightly more machined industrial typefaces. Oftentimes, they're set in a more condensed format, like this. Then, in the 20th century, at the birth of technology, designers like Paul Renner started to explore the possibility of new kinds of formal approaches, borrowing heavily from pure geometry. This is the typeface Futura. What you'll notice is the L is pretty much a simple line, and the O is almost a perfect circle. Futura was meant to replicate the pure shapes of primitive geometry, from the circles, squares, rectangles, lines. This was meant to hail towards a kind of sense of futurity. A monospace typeface is a typeface where each letter form occupies the exact same horizontal space. This was a technology that was pioneered with the birth of the typewriter, and then was used in early computers, but is still produced today, especially for people who like to code. This is all set in a monospace. So for the last part of this lecture today, I wanted to talk about the way that type foments meaning, how to make meaningful type. Type can foment meaning through its formal structure, that the shape of the letter very quickly defines a sense of association with that form. Something like this might be considered more medieval. Something like this is a much more classical form. Here we see a letter shape. This is stag stencil, I believe. No, this isn't stag stencil. This is a typeface that borrows heavily from more older typographic forms, but also including a much more sort of contemporary stenciled form. Type also foments meaning through system, not just through your choice of font, but how you choose to apply your font. This is an example of a Bureau Europa poster by the design studio Experimental Jet Set, who are known for only using pretty much one typeface for everything. But how they apply the typeface, the layering, the repetition, all of these forms helps to create meaningful compositions. Or another example is the application Weird Type designed by Zach Lieberman, which allows you to create very simple AR typographic experiments. And lastly, type foments meaning through contrast. And we've discussed this further. We've already discussed this before, but maybe we can sort of do a little quick revisitation of some of the key ones for this course. Contrast of size is a very clear and simple way of making more meaningful typographic compositions. You'll see that the title here, Typographic Matchmaking in the City, is scaled to be much larger than the subtitle, Propositions for a Pluralist Public Space, and then the smaller descriptive text. Contrast of weight, we've talked about this before. Contrast of form. Here we have some page layouts by the designer Ludovic Balland, who likes to really do the opposite of what Experimental Jet Set likes to do and use a variety of typefaces in a variety of different ways in order to create really dynamic typographic compositions. Contrast of structure. This is a poster by the Korean designers Sulki and Min, and they use multiple typographic languages to construct, or multiple languages by building custom typefaces to construct a sort of engaging formal piece. And the last couple I'm going to talk about is a contrast of texture. Here's another broadsheet by Ludovic Balland. And what happens with the contrast of texture, you very quickly see mixtures of density and sparsity on the page to create a really beautiful, engaging typographic form. Contrast of color. These risograph posters by James Goggin use color to clearly delineate different types of information. And lastly, contrast of direction. So these are some things to start to think about for this week. I will also be posting a quick workshop walkthrough video to help you with this week's assignment. If you have any questions, always don't hesitate to reach out to me. I will be available to talk during office hours and anytime you want. All right, take care.